The moment Perry Watkins rode into Sagebrush Creek on a Tuesday in the spring of 1883, Ella Collins knew that Sheriff Dolan was going to find a reason to make his life difficult before the week was out. She was standing at the window of her general store, wiping down the glass with a damp cloth, watching the dusty Main Street the way she always did in the slow afternoon hours when the heat made everything shimmer, and the town seemed to hold its breath. She noticed him because he rode slowly, not the way most drifters did when they came through, all swagger and speed, looking to impress or intimidate. This man rode like someone who had been in the saddle a very long time and had made a kind of peace with it. His horse was a dark bay with a white stripe down its nose, well kept despite the dust that covered both rider and animal. The man himself was lean but broad-shouldered, wearing a sun-faded brown coat and a hat pulled low against the afternoon light. He had a short dark beard, and he looked at Sagebrush Creek the way a person looks at something they are not sure they want but might need. Ella set down her cloth and watched him tie up outside the saloon across the street. He did not look dangerous to her, but she had learned a long time ago that her instincts and Sheriff Dolan's instincts were rarely the same thing. She went back to work. Sagebrush Creek sat in a long, shallow valley in eastern Texas, where the land was flat enough to see trouble coming from a long way off, and the sky at night was so full of stars that on clear evenings Ella sometimes stood on her porch and felt something that was almost religious. The town had about 300 souls, a church, 2 saloons, a livery, a doctor's office, a telegraph office, and Ella's store, which was the oldest business in town. Her father had built it in 1869 when she was 4 years old, and she had grown up behind its counter, learning the names of every kind of flour, every tool, every remedy, every seed. When her father died of a fever in 1879, she was 14. Her mother had passed 2 years before that. She had been running the store by herself, with the help of a hired boy named Thomas Bright, who was 16 and completely reliable, since she was 16 herself. She was 23 now, and she had never left Sagebrush Creek for more than a week at a stretch. She was not unhappy with this life. It was hers, and she had built it with her own hands, and there was dignity in that. But sometimes, in the long evenings when Thomas had gone home and the store was locked and the town was quiet, she sat at her kitchen table behind the store and felt the walls press in a little. She did not mention this to anyone. The next morning, Perry Watkins came into her store. She heard the bell above the door and looked up from the ledger she was working on. He was taller than she had registered from across the street. Up close she could see that his eyes were a particular shade of brown, that was almost amber in the morning light coming through the windows, and that there was a scar along his left jaw that had healed clean and old. He looked around the store the way people do when they are genuinely looking at things rather than performing the act of looking. "Morning," Ella said. "Morning." His voice was quieter than she expected. "I need some provisions, a few days' worth, traveling light. Passing through or staying?" "Passing through," he said, and then he paused and looked at her directly. "Though I might stay a day or two. Horse needs rest and I could use a decent meal." "Mrs. Avery over on Pine Street takes boarders," Ella said. "Her cooking is the best in town. I'll keep that in mind." She wrote up his list as he named things off: dried beans, salt pork, hardtack, a small sack of cornmeal, a tin of coffee, and she noticed that he was particular without being difficult, and that he said thank you when she handed him each item, which not every man did. She put his total on the counter and he paid it without argument, which also not every man did. "You passing through toward the territories?" she asked, because she was genuinely curious and because she had learned that asking people questions in a general store was not nosy, it was hospitality. "Heading west," he said. "Eventually." He picked up his bundle and settled it under one arm. "Name's Perry Watkins. Ella Collins." She did not offer her hand because some men in this town found that presumptuous, but she met his eyes. "Welcome to Sagebrush Creek, Mr. Watkins." "Much obliged, Miss Collins." He was out the door before she could think of anything else to say. She stood behind her counter for a moment in the quiet store with the morning light slanting through the windows and the smell of coffee and wood and dry goods around her, and she thought that there was something about him she could not quite place. Not dangerous, exactly. More like someone who had seen hard things and had not been made cruel by them, which was its own kind of remarkable. She went back to her ledger. She did not know that less than an hour later, Sheriff Hank Dolan would be in the saloon having what the barkeeper Ned Foley would later describe as a very serious conversation with Perry Watkins, or that by afternoon the whole town would have heard some version of it. Sheriff Hank Dolan was 47 years old and had been the law in Sagebrush Creek for 11 years. He was not a bad man. Ella had always been careful about that distinction in her own mind. But he was a man who had a very fixed idea of how things ought to be and who belonged where, and drifters troubled him on principle. He was big and raw-boned with a gray mustache and a star that he wore like a point of theology. He had been decent to Ella after her father died, and she had always respected him for that. But he had a way of deciding about people very fast and not reconsidering, and this was his great flaw. By mid-afternoon he came into the store. Ella looked up. "Sheriff, Miss Collins." He took off his hat, which he always did in her store, and held it in both hands. "I want to tell you something as a courtesy." "All right. That drifter who came through this morning bought supplies from you." "Perry Watkins." He said the name like a thing to be careful of. "I know that name. He's got a history. Was riding with a crew up in Kansas 3 years back that was mixed up in some ugly business. Stock theft, roughing up homesteaders, that kind of thing. Never formally charged, mind you, but the name came across the wire when I ran him." Ella set down her pen. "He seemed perfectly polite when he was in here." "They often do," Dolan said. "I just want you to be aware. You're alone in this store a good part of the day, and you're a young woman, and I don't want you taking unnecessary risks being friendly." Ella kept her expression even. "I appreciate you telling me, Sheriff. I've told him he can stay the night at Mrs. Avery's, get his horse properly rested, and then he ought to be moving on. I was clear about that." "I see." Dolan replaced his hat. "You just keep your door locked after dark is all I'm saying." When he left, Ella stood behind her counter and thought about this information for a while. She thought about the way Perry Watkins had said thank you for each item she handed him, and the way he had looked at her directly when he spoke, and the way he had ridden into town slowly, like a man who was tired and not looking for trouble. She thought about how Hank Dolan's record on reading people was not what she would call perfect. She remembered the way he had nearly run the Ramirez family off their homestead 2 years ago on the basis of a rumor that had turned out to be entirely false, and the way he had decided old Mr. Beaumont was a drunk based on no more evidence than the man's red nose, which was actually rosacea. She did not dismiss what the sheriff had said, but she did not accept it wholesale either. She went on with her day. Perry Watkins did not come back to the store that afternoon. But at supper time, when Ella was walking home from the church where she sang in the choir on Tuesday evenings, she passed the small park beside the post office, and she saw him sitting on a bench there alone, reading a book in the fading light. Just reading. She would not have thought much of this except that it was a real book, cloth-bound, not a dime novel, and he was reading it with the focused attention of someone who actually cared what was on the page. She did not stop, but she noticed. She told herself that noticing was not the same as taking an interest. The following morning was Wednesday, and Thomas Bright came in early to restock the shelves, and Ella was in the back going over inventory when the bell above the door rang. She heard Thomas greet someone, and then Thomas appeared in the doorway to the back room. "Miss Collins, it's that man who was in yesterday, the drifter." "Send him back here," she said without quite knowing why she said that rather than going out front. Perry Watkins appeared in the doorway of the back room. He had to duck slightly under the low frame. He was holding his hat in his hands, turning it slowly. "Miss Collins." "Mr. Watkins." She looked up from her inventory sheets. "What can I do for you?" "I wanted to buy something else," he said, "but I also wanted to apologize for anything I might have done that made you uncomfortable yesterday." She blinked. You didn't do anything that made me uncomfortable. I get the impression the sheriff may have spoken to you. He has a way of making people nervous about strangers, and I didn't want you to feel. He stopped. He seemed to be choosing words carefully. I didn't want you to feel that you had cause for alarm on my account. Ella put down her inventory sheet and looked at him properly. Did you ride with a crew in Kansas 3 years ago? He met her gaze. I did. Were they involved in stock theft and harassing homesteaders? A pause. His jaw set slightly. I didn't know what they were about when I joined up. I figured it out after about 3 weeks and I left. I haven't been back to Kansas since. Can you prove that? No, he said. I can't prove most things about myself. That's the nature of moving around the way I do. He looked at her steadily. I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I just wanted to say it to your face so you had the information. Ella studied him for a long moment. What were you doing with a crew like that in the first place? He was quiet for a moment. Looking for work in the wrong place. I've been moving around since I was 17, and sometimes the wrong work is the only work available. I'm not proud of those 3 weeks, but I left before anything I couldn't live with happened. How old are you now? 26. She nodded slowly. She was 23. She did not know why she noted that specifically. What book were you reading last night? She asked. He blinked at the change of direction. Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. Is it good? I've read it 3 times, he said, and something in his face shifted slightly, becoming less guarded. She turned back to her inventory sheet. I'll need some help moving barrels from the cellar to the front room this afternoon. Thomas has to leave early today. I'll pay you for your time if you're willing. I don't need payment. I don't accept work that isn't paid for, she said. $2 for the afternoon. All right, he said. Thomas gave her a very particular look when she came back out front, and she addressed it directly. He says he left that crew in Kansas before anything serious happened. I believe him for now. If he does anything concerning, you tell me immediately. Yes, ma'am, Thomas said, though he still looked uncertain. Perry Watkins worked hard that afternoon, and he was good at it. He moved the barrels with efficiency and without complaint, and he helped her reorganize a section of shelving that had been bothering her for months. He did not make unnecessary conversation, but he was not unfriendly, and when she did speak to him, he answered with a directness she appreciated. She learned in the course of 2 hours of work that he had grown up in Missouri, that his father had died in the war when Perry was 9, that his mother had remarried a man who was difficult to live with, that he had left home at 17 and had been working his way west ever since, taking jobs on ranches and in mines, and once on a riverboat in Louisiana. He spoke of all this without self-pity, which she found more affecting than if he had been dramatic about it. At 5 o'clock she paid him his $2 and he put them in his shirt pocket and said, "Thank you, Miss Collins." "Thank you, Mr. Watkins." She paused. "Will you be leaving tomorrow? The sheriff seems to think I ought to." "What do you think?" He turned his hat over in his hands. "I think I haven't decided yet," she nodded. "Mrs. Avery keeps a fair room and she serves breakfast at 7. He almost smiled, just almost. "Good to know." After he left, she stood in her empty store in the quiet of early evening and she acknowledged to herself, plainly and without drama, that she wanted him to stay. She could not have explained this with any great precision. It was not merely that he was handsome, though he was. It was something about the combination of his steadiness and his honesty, the way he looked at things like they mattered, the Dickens novel on the park bench in the fading light. She had met plenty of men in Sagebrush Creek who wanted to court her. She was the only businesswoman her age in 3 counties, and she had her father's store, and she was not unpleasant to look at, and she had turned all of them down without much difficulty, because none of them had made her feel anything she could not easily set aside. Perry Watkins made her feel something she was not sure she could set aside. This was alarming and interesting in equal measure. She went home, made her supper, and thought about it until she went to sleep. The next morning, Thursday, Sheriff Dolan came by again. He was less courteous this time. "I heard you had Watkins in your store yesterday afternoon," he said. "I hired him to help with some lifting. I paid him fairly. Miss Collins, I told you that man. You told me he was associated with a crew in Kansas 3 years ago, Ella said. You also told me he was never formally charged with anything. I needed help in the store, he was available, and he behaved himself entirely. That's all there is to it. Dolan's mustache moved in a way that expressed displeasure without requiring words. I want him out of town by Saturday. That's your business, Ella said. My business is my store. After he left, she stood behind her counter feeling something solidify inside her. She was not a woman who was easily pushed around, and she did not appreciate the sheriff's implication that she could not make reasonable judgments about the people she dealt with. He was the law in this town, and she respected that. But she was the keeper of her own store and her own life. That evening, Perry came into the store at closing time. He came to the back, where she was tallying the day's receipts, and he sat in the chair she indicated, and he said, "The sheriff came to see me this morning." "He came to see me too. He wants me gone by Saturday." "I know." Perry looked at his hands. They were good hands. She had noticed working hands with calluses in the right places. "Miss Collins, I don't want to cause trouble for you. If my being here is making things difficult—" "You haven't made anything difficult," she said. "Sheriff Dolan makes things difficult. That's separate from you." He looked up at her. In the lamplight, his amber eyes were very clear. "You're not afraid of him." "He's not something to be afraid of," she said. "He's a stubborn man who thinks he knows better than he does. I deal with him the same way I deal with a customer who thinks he knows what he wants until I tell him what he actually needs." Perry let out a quiet laugh. It transformed his face, and Ella's heart did a small, complicated thing that she tried to be sensible about. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I want to be straight about it because I think you're someone who deserves straight talk." "Go ahead." He met her eyes. "I've been in a lot of towns. I've passed through hundreds of places since I left Missouri. Most of them I don't remember much about. I've been here 3 days and I remember every part of it, which is mostly because of the 2 hours I spent moving your barrels." Ella set down her pen very deliberately. "That's a somewhat unusual way to express that. I'm not a very usual kind of man, I don't think." "No," she agreed. "You're not." The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that holds something. "I'm going to be honest with you," she said. "I notice things about people. It's part of running a store. You learn to read what someone actually needs versus what they're asking for. And I've noticed several things about you that I find that I would not be unhappy if you did not leave on Saturday." Perry was very still. "That's the most careful confession I've ever heard." "I don't make confessions carelessly." "No," he said softly. "I can see that." He left shortly after, and Ella sat alone in the lamplight for a while before she locked up and went to bed. She slept badly, which she attributed to the coffee she had drunk too late in the day. Friday was busy. The weekly supply wagon came in from Laredo, and she spent most of the morning unloading and cataloging. And Thomas helped, and Perry appeared at noon without being asked, and worked alongside Thomas without any awkwardness or the need for introduction, because Thomas had apparently decided that a man who read Dickens was probably all right. They talked while they worked, Thomas about his family's farm, Perry about a cattle drive he had worked in New Mexico the previous autumn, and Ella moved between them taking inventory and feeling something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the sense that her store was full in the way it should be. At lunchtime she brought out bread and salt pork and dried apple, and they ate together at the back table. And Perry told them about the time in Louisiana when the riverboat he was working on lost its paddle in a storm and drifted for 2 days before another boat found them. And Thomas laughed until his eyes watered. And Ella ate her bread and watched Perry tell the story and thought about something her father had said to her once, which was that you could tell a great deal about a man's heart by watching him make another person laugh. In the afternoon, Perry fixed the hinge on the back door that had been sticking since February and she had simply been dealing with. He did it without making a production of it, just saw it needed doing and did it. When she thanked him, he shrugged and said, "You were favoring your wrist pushing it. It would have got worse." She had not known that he noticed her favoring her wrist. The fact that he noticed small things undid something in her that had been carefully knotted for a long time. That evening, as she was closing up and the sun was going down behind the flat horizon in a wash of orange and violet, Perry leaned against the doorframe of the back room and said, "I'm thinking about staying." Ella folded her apron slowly. "What would you do for work?" "I've been thinking about that too. There's a ranch east of here, the Caldwell place. I've heard they're looking for hands. I'm a good rider and I know cattle work." "The Caldwell Ranch is a solid operation," she said. "James Caldwell is a fair employer. He doesn't underpay and he doesn't ask men to do things that aren't right. You know him well. He's been a customer since I was a girl. Good man." She looked up at him. "Sheriff Dolan will not be pleased." "I suspect not." Perry held her gaze. "But I'm not making this decision based on what pleases Sheriff Dolan." "What are you making it based on?" she asked, though she thought she knew. "I think you know the answer to that, Miss Collins." She felt the warmth move through her, slow and certain. "Ella," she said, "you've been calling me Miss Collins for 4 days and it's beginning to seem formal." "Ella," he said, and the way he said her name, quiet and deliberate, like something valuable being handled carefully, made her want to look away and not look away at the same time. "Perry," she answered, "I think you should go to the Caldwell Ranch tomorrow and ask about the work." He smiled, and this time it was a full smile, not just almost. It changed everything about his face, and she filed it away somewhere private and important. That night she put a candle in the front window of the store before she went through to her back quarters to sleep. She stood and looked at the candle for a moment, the small flame wavering gently in the dark glass. And she thought about what she was doing, which was leaving a light in the window, so that if Perry Watkins rode past on his way somewhere or walked by in the night and looked toward the store, he would see a light and know she was not afraid of him being here. It was not a complicated gesture, but it was a deliberate one, and she was not a woman who made gestures without intention. She knew the sheriff had warned her. She left the candle in the window anyway. She slept better that night than she had all week. On Saturday morning, Perry did not leave. He was at the Caldwell Ranch by 8 in the morning, having ridden out before Sagebrush Creek was properly awake. Ella found this out from James Caldwell himself, who came into the store around noon for his weekly supplies. "Had a young fellow come out this morning asking about work," Caldwell said, setting his list on the counter. He was a weathered man in his 50s with a careful face and steady gray eyes. "Perry Watkins, you know him." "He's been in town a few days," Ella said carefully. "Knows his work, good with horses. I took him on." Caldwell looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has noticed more than he is saying. "He mentioned your store, said you told him we were a fair operation." "I did say that." "Well," Caldwell picked up his list, "he seems like a good man, quiet, does what he says he'll do." A pause. "Dolan's going to have something to say about it." "Dolan has something to say about most things," Ella replied pleasantly, and Caldwell laughed. She had been right about Dolan. "He came in that afternoon looking like a thundercloud wearing a star." "Caldwell hired Watkins," he said without preamble. "I heard. Did you have something to do with that?" "I told Mr. Watkins that Mr. Caldwell ran a good operation, that's all." Dolan looked at her for a long moment. "Miss Collins, I have known you since you were a little girl. I was friends with your father. I'm not speaking to you as the law right now. I'm speaking to you as someone who cares about your well-being." Ella softened slightly. "I know that Hank." He looked surprised she rarely used his first name. "That man has a way of landing in trouble. Not always his fault, maybe, but it finds him, and I don't want it finding you." "I appreciate that," she said. "I genuinely do. But I'm 23 years old and I have been making my own judgments about people since I was 16, and my record is not bad." She met his eyes. "I'll be careful, I promise you that." Dolan replaced his hat. He looked like a man who had more to say and was choosing not to say it. "All right," he said finally, "but I'll be watching." "I know you will," she said. He left and she stood in the quiet store and thought that she wished it did not have to be this way, the sheriff watching, the town noticing, the careful management of everyone else's feelings about a man who had done nothing wrong. It was the particular tax that came with being a woman alone in a small town, this constant need to account for yourself, to explain your choices, to be seen as either reckless or wise but never simply as a person making a decision. She was tired of it, she realized. She had been quietly tired of it for years. She went back to work. Perry came to the store on Sunday evening, which was his day off from the Caldwell Ranch. He looked different, he had washed up. His clothes were clean and he had trimmed his beard. He came to the back room where she was reading, and she set aside her book. She was reading George Eliot, which she had ordered from a bookseller in San Antonio, and they talked for nearly 3 hours. Not about anything urgent or important, just talked, the way two people do when they are discovering each other. She told him about her parents, about her childhood in the store, about the way her father had taught her to read by having her read the labels on all the tins. He told her about Missouri, about the green of it after the dry West, about his mother who had been a school teacher before the war. He told her about New Mexico, the mountains, the color of the sky at altitude, the way Spanish and English tangled in the air of every town. She told him about the stars from her porch on clear nights, and he said he wanted to see them. "You can come out some evening," she said. "The porch looks west. The view is very good. I'd like that." The following Thursday he came and sat on her porch after supper. They sat in the blue dusk and watched the stars come out one by one, and she told him the names of the constellations her father had taught her. He knew some of them and not others, and she liked that about him, that he did not pretend to know more than he did. The Caldwell Ranch was 5 miles east of town, so he had ridden in after his work was done, and the ride back in the dark would be long. And she offered coffee before he left, and he accepted. And they sat at her kitchen table until nearly 10 o'clock, and she thought that this was what it was supposed to feel like, this particular ease and warmth, and the sense that time was doing something it did not usually do, which was going slowly enough to actually be experienced. He rode out at 10, tipping his hat at the door, and she watched his horse disappear into the darkness from the porch step, and then she went back inside and stood in her kitchen and pressed her hand flat against the table where he had been sitting, which was a very strange and specific thing to do, and she recognized that. She left the candle in the window again. The following Tuesday, Mrs. Avery, who was 64 and missed nothing, cornered Ella at the post office. "That Watkins boy has been out to your store 3 times this week," she said, in the tone of someone delivering facts rather than making judgment. "He has," Ella agreed. "He's polite," Mrs. Avery said. "Very clean. Always returns his dishes after I've fed him, and he reads. I know. I'm not warning you off him," Mrs. Avery said. "I'm not Hank Dolan. I'm just saying this town talks, and it's going to talk about you too. You ought to know that." "This town talked when I refused to sell the store after my father died," Ella said. "It talked when I hired Thomas instead of one of the men who applied. It talked when I ordered books from San Antonio. I'm used to it." Mrs. Avery laughed, a short, surprised sound. "Fair enough, girl, fair enough." She walked away, and Ella collected her mail, a catalog from a dry goods wholesaler in Dallas, and a letter from her father's sister in Virginia who wrote twice a year. And she walked back to the store thinking that she was going to have to decide something fairly soon about Perry Watkins, not for anyone else's benefit but for her own, because she could feel herself moving toward something, and she did not like moving toward things without knowing what she intended. She thought about this all afternoon. At closing time, Perry appeared at the door. He had not been expected. This was not a Sunday, but he looked like a man who had come with specific purpose. He was holding his hat, and he was slightly dusty from the ride, and he looked at her with an expression she had been cataloging over the past 2 weeks, which was the expression of a man who is working very hard to say something true. "I need to say something to you," he said. "Come in then." He came in. Thomas was gone. The store was empty and golden in the evening light. "I'm not a man who stays," Perry said. "I've never been a man who stays. I want you to know that I know that about myself, and I'm not pretending otherwise." Ella sat on the edge of her counter and folded her hands. "All right." But I also want you to know that since I came to this town, I have been thinking very seriously about whether there is something here that would make a man want to change that about himself." She looked at him steadily. "And what have you concluded?" He crossed the floor slowly and stopped a few feet from her, and she noticed that his breathing was slightly different than usual, which meant that this was costing him something. "I've concluded," he said, that you are. That I'd very much like to court you properly, if you're willing to be courted, and if you're willing to put up with the sheriff's objections and the town's opinions, and the fact that I don't have much to offer you except myself, which may or may not be worth a great deal." Ella sat very still for a moment. She thought about all the careful, rational things she could say, that she needed to think about it, that she barely knew him, that the risks were considerable. She thought about the candle in the window. She thought about the stars he had watched from her porch. She thought about her father saying you can tell a man's heart by how he makes another person laugh. "I think you're worth a considerable amount," she said, "and I think I've known that since you read Dickens in the park on Tuesday evening." He looked at her. The amber eyes were very warm. "You saw me in the park. I see most things on this street," she said. "It's my window." He laughed, and she laughed too, and something between them clicked into place with the clean certainty of a lock finding its key. He came to her porch on Sunday and every Sunday after that, and on Thursday evenings when he could manage it, and sometimes on Wednesdays when James Caldwell let the hands off early. They walked the road north of town where the land opened up into wide grassland and the wind came off the flat horizon smelling of dust and sage. They talked constantly about books and memory and what they believed and what they had learned from failure, and they were also sometimes quiet together, which Ella thought was perhaps even more important. A man she could be quiet with. She had not known how much she wanted that. He was careful with her. Not in the way that suggested he thought she was fragile. She was not fragile, and she did not want to be treated as if she were, but careful in the sense of attention and intention, of not taking things for granted, of treating each conversation and each evening as something to be respected. On the fourth Sunday, she put her hand in his while they were walking, and he held it with a kind of quiet seriousness that made her feel seen in the way she had stopped hoping to be seen. The town, as Mrs. Avery had predicted, was talking. Not unkindly, for the most part Perry had demonstrated over the weeks at the Caldwell Ranch that he was a capable and reliable worker, and James Caldwell's endorsement carried considerable weight. Even some of the people who had been wary softened. Mrs. Ramirez, who ran the other dry goods operation on the far end of town, and who Ella counted as a friend, said over the fence one evening, "He looks at you like you're the most interesting thing he's ever seen." "That's alarming," Ella said. "It's wonderful and you know it," Mrs. Ramirez said flatly. "The exception was Dolan." Dolan watched and waited and said little, but Ella could see it in his face when he came into the store, the assessment, the reservation, the stubborn refusal to revise his initial judgment. She did not push it. She let him be what he was, and she trusted time to do what argument would not. And then, on a Saturday in late June, something happened that Ella had not expected. There was a man named Reuben Corder, who had been making trouble along the Laredo Road for the better part of the spring. He had a small crew with him, 4 or 5 men, and they had been stopping supply wagons and helping themselves to goods, and twice they had burned fences on homesteads south of town. He was not a significant outlaw by the measure of the territories, not someone with a bounty or a legend, but he was consistent and he was mean, and he had been moving progressively closer to Sagebrush Creek, and Sheriff Dolan had been in correspondence with the county sheriff in Laredo about it for weeks. On that Saturday, Reuben Corder and 2 of his men rode into Sagebrush Creek. Ella was alone in the store. Thomas had gone to the county fair with his family. Perry was at the Caldwell Ranch, and not expected until Sunday. She heard the horses outside and looked through her clean window and recognized from the description she'd heard that the man with the cropped red beard and the raw scar across his cheekbone was Corder. They came into the store. Ella put her hands flat on the counter and said, "Good afternoon, gentlemen." Corder looked around the store with the specific expression of a man who has never been impressed by anything. "You the owner?" "I am." "Then you can help us." He named several items, the kind of items that told her they were resupplying, nothing more, and she moved to get them without showing the feeling behind her ribs, which was that her hands wanted to shake, and she was not going to let them. She measured out the flour and the coffee, and she kept her face calm, and her voice, even because showing fear to men like this was never useful. One of Corder's men, younger, fidgety, had moved behind her counter. "I'd ask you to step back around to the customer's side," she said, without turning from what she was doing. "Is that right?" "Not a question. That's right." There was a moment of the particular kind of tension that exists before something happens, and then the door opened and Perry Watkins walked in. She did not know then that he had seen the horses outside and recognized the brand from descriptions that had been going around. She did not know that he had stopped, thought about it, and chosen to come in. She found all of this out later. In the moment, she only knew that the bell above the door rang and he was there. He stopped just inside the door and took in the whole room in one look. His eyes went to Ella first, then to the man behind the counter, then to Corder. "Afternoon," he said, conversational, easy. Corder turned to look at him. Something calculated moved through his expression. "You're Watkins." Perry kept his expression easy. "I am." Corder tilted his head. "You rode with Garrett's crew out of Kansas, 3 years back." "For about 3 weeks," Perry said. "Then I left. Old news." "Heard you left before the real work started." "Heard right." Perry moved casually to the counter, away from the door, positioning himself in a way that required Corder and his men to partially turn from Ella. "What are you doing in Sagebrush Creek?" "Corder. Buying provisions, just like anybody." "Well then," Perry looked at the man behind Ella's counter. "There's a customer side and a shop side. You're on the wrong one." A long moment. The fidgety young man looked at Corder, who was looking at Perry with the flat calculation of a man measuring odds. Ella continued packing the provisions without looking up, her hands perfectly steady. Corder said, "No need for any drama," and he nodded to his man, who stepped back around the counter. Ella finished the packing and named the total, and Corder paid it without argument. She thought he had decided that drama here, in a town with a lawman and in front of a witness, was not worth whatever it might cost him, and he took the goods and he and his men left. When the door closed, Ella set both hands on the counter and let out a breath. Perry was at the counter in 2 strides. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." She looked up at him. "How did you know to come in?" "I saw the horses, recognized the brands from what Caldwell said." He was searching her face. "You're sure you're all right?" "I was managing." "I know you were," he said. "I could see that." She looked at him. He was close enough that she could see the pulse at his throat, slightly elevated. He had come in when he did not have to, when leaving would have been entirely reasonable, and he had done it calmly and without drama, and he had positioned himself to protect her without diminishing her. She thought about all of this in the space of a few seconds, and then she reached up and took his face in both her hands and kissed him. He was still for one surprised heartbeat, and then he kissed her back, and it was exactly the way she would have wanted it to be if she had been the kind of person who spent time imagining such things, which she was and had been, though she would have been very reluctant to admit it. When she stepped back, his hands were at her waist and his eyes were very warm. "That was not what I was expecting," he said. "It was what I wanted to do. I'm very glad you did it." She straightened her apron and turned back to reorganizing the counter. "You should probably tell the sheriff about Corder being in town." "I will," he said. He was still looking at her with that expression she had been cataloging. "Ella, go tell the sheriff," she said, but she was smiling with her back to him and she thought he probably knew it. He went and she stood alone in her store in the afternoon light, and she felt something huge and clear move through her that she recognized. Because it had been described in books she had read and songs she had heard, something wide and warm and a little frightening in the best possible way. She thought, so this is it then. This is what it is. She closed the store early and went out to her porch and sat in the summer evening and let herself feel it properly. Dolan spoke to Perry that evening, and then he sent the telegraph to Laredo, and within 2 days, Reuben Corder and his crew were picked up by the county sheriff 20 miles south of Sagebrush Creek when they tried to hold up a freight wagon. Corder was arrested and his operation was finished. Dolan did not acknowledge Perry's part in alerting him, but he said to Ella when he came to collect his weekly supplies that following Monday, "Your young man has a good eye." It was the first time he had called Perry your young man, and it was as close to approval as Hank Dolan had in him. "He does," Ella agreed, and let it stand at that. Summer moved through Sagebrush Creek in the way it always did, blazing and slow, with the long evenings and the smell of grass drying in the heat, and the thunderstorms that came up fast from the south, and were spectacular in a way that made everything feel temporary and magnificent. Perry rode in on Sundays, and they walked and they talked and they sat on her porch, and sometimes in the evenings he helped her with accounts or repairs, and she began to understand the particular shape of his character more fully. His patience, his humor, which was dry and specific, his habit of sitting quietly when he was thinking something through rather than filling the silence with noise, his habit of noticing things, not in the intrusive way, but in the attentive way, the way he noticed her. She began to understand also, slowly and without drama, that she was in love with him. Not in the breathless, girlish sense she had read about in novels and dismissed as impossible. She was not a breathless, girlish person, but in the deep, certain sense of recognizing that someone fit into your life at a level that had nothing to do with convenience and everything to do with truth. He fit. That was the simplest way she could put it. He fit the way her father's chair fit the corner of her kitchen, the way the key fit the lock on her front door, the way the right book felt in her hands. She told him so in early August, on her porch on a warm evening with the stars out and the sound of crickets in the grass. "I'm in love with you," she said, in the same tone she might use to report a fact about inventory. "I thought you should know." He turned to look at her. The lamplight through the window reached them faintly. "Ella Collins," he said quietly, "I'm not saying it to put any pressure on you or on this situation," she continued. "I'm saying it because it's true, and I believe in saying true things out loud." He was quiet for a moment, and she sat with the quiet the way she had learned to, without trying to fill it. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since the day you asked me if I could prove I'd left that crew in Kansas, and when I said I couldn't, you hired me anyway." She looked at him. "That was a business decision. It was also an act of faith," he said. "I hadn't had many of those." He reached across and took her hand. "I'm in love with you. I've known it for weeks. I've been trying to figure out how to say it without making you feel like I was asking for something you hadn't offered." She turned her hand in his so their fingers laced together. "I'm offering," she said. He kissed her, slowly and deliberate, on the dark porch in the August night, with the stars blazing above the flat Texas horizon and the crickets loud in the grass, and she thought, This is what I put the candle in the window for." The weeks that followed were the happiest she had known since her childhood, when her father was alive and the store was full of his presence. She felt that happiness and was not afraid of it, because she had decided long ago that happiness was not a thing to be suspicious of, but a thing to be inhabited fully when it came. In September, Perry spoke to James Caldwell about a parcel of land adjacent to the Caldwell Ranch that had been going unused, a section of about 40 acres, with a creek running through it that fed into the larger drainage. Caldwell had been holding it loosely, no strong claim, and he was willing to sell it for a fair price. Perry came to Ella with this information on a Sunday evening and laid it out carefully. "I've saved enough to buy the land and put up a basic structure," he said. "It would be mine. I'd have something to offer." She looked at him steadily. "You already have something to offer, Perry. I know you don't need me to have land. I know you have your own. I'm saying it for myself because I want to build something. I want to have a place." He paused. "I've been moving my whole life. I'm tired of moving." She held his gaze. "What are you saying exactly?" He reached into his coat pocket and placed a simple ring on the table between them, not elaborate, just a plain gold band, something he had bought from the jeweler in town named Mr. Gaines, who had made it by hand. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. "I'm asking you to marry me," he said. "I'm asking clearly because I believe you deserve clarity." Ella looked at the ring on the table. She thought about everything she had built in this town, the store, the life, the independence. She thought about whether loving someone and building something with them was the same as losing what she had, and she concluded, as she had been concluding slowly for the past months, that it was not that the fear of loss was the wrong framework entirely. The right framework was the addition of something irreplaceable. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath that told her he had not been entirely certain. "Yes," she said again, more warmly, and reached for the ring. He put it on her finger himself, and it fit, and she thought that fitting things were underrated as signs. She told Mrs. Avery the next morning, and Mrs. Avery cried, which Ella had not expected. She told Sheriff Dolan in the afternoon, standing behind her counter while he came in for his Monday supplies. She said it plainly. "I'm engaged to Perry Watkins. I wanted to tell you directly." Dolan was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his hat, he looked at his hands, he looked up at her. "You're certain?" he said. "I am." Another pause, then, "He's been solid at Caldwell's ranch. I'll give him that." He set his hat back on his head. "You're going to keep the store?" "Of course." "That's good, you've kept it well." He picked up his supplies. "I'll expect him to treat you right." "He will." Dolan nodded once and walked out, and Ella stood in the golden morning light of her store and felt the specific satisfaction of a man revising his position, even when it cost him something to do it. She appreciated it more than she would have appreciated an easy capitulation. The wedding was planned for October, which was when the heat broke, and the sky became the deep, brilliant blue of the Texas autumn. Mrs. Avery organized most of it, which Ella was grateful for because she understood flower arrangements and seating charts approximately as well as she understood Sanskrit. Perry bought the 40 acres from Caldwell, and on Saturdays and Sundays, and every spare hour between he and some of the Caldwell ranch hands built a house. Not large, nothing elaborate, 4 rooms and a good roof and a porch that faced west for the sunsets. Ella watched it go up over the weeks with a feeling that was specific and not reducible to words, which was not a feeling she often had, being a person who was generally good at words. She walked out one Sunday afternoon in late September when the frame was up and the walls were going and Perry was on the roof in the clear light, and she stood in the dry grass below and looked up at him. "There's a window there," she said, pointing. "On the west-facing wall." "I know," he said. "Good view of the horizon." "You could put a candle in it," she said. He looked down at her, a slow smile. "I intend to," he said. She laughed, and he laughed from the roof, and one of the ranch hands who was working nearby looked up in confusion at both of them laughing for no apparent reason, and this made them laugh harder. They were married on the 15th of October, 1883, in the Sagebrush Creek church with the Reverend Timmons officiating and the whole town in attendance, or near enough. Mrs. Avery had filled the church with autumn wildflowers, yellows and oranges and deep reds, and the day was so clear and bright that the light through the windows made everything look polished. Ella wore her mother's dress, which she had spent 3 evenings altering to fit, and she stood at the altar with Perry clean-shaved for the occasion, which she had not been expecting, and which changed his face in a way that made her look at him with new attention, and they made their vows in front of everyone they knew. She had written her own vows, which was not common but which she did not care about. She was not going to say words that were not her own at the most significant moment of her adult life. She said, "I have spent a long time building something that is mine, and I had decided that this was enough, that I did not need to build anything with anyone. You changed that conclusion, and I'm grateful for it, and I intend to keep building beside you, not instead of myself." Perry's vows were shorter, but she had known they would be, because he was not a man who used more words than necessary, and this had always been one of the things she valued. He said, "I have spent my life moving away from things. I choose to stop. I choose to move toward you, and I intend to keep doing that for the rest of my life." Sheriff Dolan was in the fifth row, and when she glanced at him during the exchange of vows, she thought his expression was as close to moved as she had ever seen it. After the ceremony, there was a gathering in the church hall, and Mrs. Ramirez had made tamales, and Mrs. Avery had made 3 pies, and James Caldwell had brought a case of decent bourbon that went faster than anyone had anticipated. Thomas Bright danced with every woman in the room who would allow it, which was most of them. Perry danced with Ella 3 times, and then she made him dance with Mrs. Avery because the old woman was looking wistful, and he did it without complaint and with great patience. And Mrs. Avery told him afterward that he was the best young man she had known in 20 years, and he looked slightly embarrassed, and Ella loved him exactly and completely in that moment. They moved into the new house that night, 40 acres with a creek, 4 good rooms, and a west-facing porch with a view of the flat horizon, where the stars came out one by one above the dark grass. She brought a candle from the store and put it in the west window and lit it before she went to bed. Perry leaned in the bedroom doorway watching her do this. "The sheriff warned you," he said quietly, "the very first week." "He did," she agreed. "And you left the candle anyway." She turned to look at him in the lamplight. "I left the candle anyway." He crossed the room and put his arms around her from behind, his chin at her temple, both of them looking at the small flame in the dark window. "I'm glad you did," he said. "So am I," she said. "I'm very glad I did." The autumn in Sagebrush Creek that year was particularly beautiful. The blue skies, and the smell of cold coming in from the north at nights, and the long amber afternoons. Ella continued running the store, riding in from the ranch each morning and riding home each evening, which she had been doing since before her marriage and saw no reason to stop. Some people in town found this unusual, a married woman keeping her own business, riding alone, but she paid those opinions approximately as much mind as she paid to the weather, which was to say she acknowledged it and moved on. Thomas Bright became her assistant manager and was so good at it that she was able to spend 2 afternoons a week doing the books and the ordering from home, which she found she preferred. Perry worked the Caldwell ranch through the autumn, and in November, when the first real cold came in, he and James Caldwell made an arrangement that turned out to suit them both. Perry would manage the east section of the Caldwell operation and receive a portion of the proceeds, which allowed him to work with considerable independence and build equity, rather than simply drawing a wage. Caldwell said later that it was the best business decision he'd made in 5 years, which Perry told Ella over supper one evening, and which she received with the particular satisfaction of someone whose early assessment of a situation has proved accurate. In the evenings they read. She had 2 shelves of books, and he had a growing collection of his own, and sometimes they read aloud to each other, which was something her father had done with her mother, and which she had missed without quite knowing it. He read well, with a natural sense of the rhythm of sentences, and she told him once that it was one of her favorite things about him, and he looked at her as if she had given him something he had not expected, which perhaps she had. In the winter months, when the short days and long evenings pressed the world small and close, they learned each other in all the ordinary domestic ways that matter more than the extraordinary ones. The way he made coffee, which was strong enough to disturb a dead man. The way she stacked books horizontally on the shelf, because she had too many and he reorganized them vertically out of principle. And they had their first real argument about this, which lasted 20 minutes and ended with both of them laughing. They learned the way she slept very still and he moved in his sleep, the way she made decisions fast and he thought things through from every angle, the way they were each strong where the other was less so, and how this was not competition but balance. February brought the news that Mrs. Ramirez's son Alejandro, who was 20 and had gone to work in the silver mines in Arizona, had been in an accident and was coming home to recover. Perry rode to the Ramirez homestead with lumber and helped build an addition to accommodate the boy's recovery, and Ella organized a rotation of neighbors to bring food for the family. And this was the kind of thing that a community does and that mattered beyond words. The town saw Perry in this light, the quiet, steady, useful kind of man, and whatever residual suspicion had attached to him from Dolan's early warnings dissolved completely in the course of that winter. Sheriff Dolan, to his credit, finally said what needed saying. He came into the store on a cold February morning and he stood at the counter and said, "I believe I was wrong about your husband, Miss Collins. Mrs. Watkins." "I know," she said gently. "I appreciate you saying it." Dolan nodded. "He's a good man." "He is," she said. "Your father would have liked him." She felt this in the place she kept her father's memory, warm and specific. "I think so too," she said. Dolan bought his supplies and tipped his hat and left, and she stood in the winter light of her store and thought that the world contained more room for change than it sometimes appeared to. In early March, she realized she was going to have a baby. She told Perry on a Sunday evening when they were sitting at the kitchen table after supper, the lamp turned up against the cold dark outside. She said it plainly, as she said most things. "I think we're going to have a child." He looked at her. The amber eyes went very still, and then something moved through them that she had not quite seen before, something large and quiet and profound. "You're certain?" "Fairly," she said. "I'll have Dr. Hennessy confirm it, but I'm fairly certain." He reached across the table and took both her hands. He held them for a long moment without speaking. "Are you frightened?" he asked. She considered this honestly. "A little. More of the things I don't know than the things I do." "Me too," he said. "More than a little." She squeezed his hands. "Good. I think that's appropriate, Doctor." Hennessy confirmed it the following Thursday. The baby was expected in October, which struck Ella as pleasingly symmetrical. Their first autumn as a married couple, their first October anniversary, and now a new life starting in the month that had given them so much. She told Mrs. Avery, who cried again. She told Mrs. Ramirez, who hugged her so hard her ribs protested. She told Thomas, who turned very red and congratulated her with such earnestness that she had to look away to keep from laughing. She told Dolan when he came for his Monday supplies, and he did something she had never seen him do before, which was smile in a way that reached his eyes. The pregnancy was not easy. The summer months were hot, and she was tired in a way that no amount of sleep fully resolved, but she continued working because she was not a woman who stopped. And Perry had said, gently and specifically, that he was not going to tell her what she could or could not do, and that he trusted her to know her own body and limits. She loved him for this, with a particular gratitude that she expressed by cooking him the best supper she could manage on a Sunday evening, which he received with evident appreciation. The house felt different in those months, fuller. She could not explain it better than that. It was the same 4 rooms, the same west-facing porch, the same view of the horizon, but the knowledge of what was coming filled the spaces with something warm and anticipatory. Perry worked with a focused energy during those months, finishing projects on the ranch and on their property that he had been getting to gradually, as if the deadline concentrated everything. He built a small additional room off the back of the house, and she helped where she could, and they painted it together on a September Saturday with the windows open and the smell of autumn beginning in the cool air, and she thought, "I am happy. I am genuinely and foundedly happy." Not the performed happiness of someone making the best of things, but the real thing. The baby came on October the 4th. Dr. Hennessy attended, and Mrs. Avery was there because Ella had asked for her, and Perry stayed close all through it, closer than most husbands did. She heard him talking to her in the hardest hours, steady and low, reminding her she was capable and strong, and she thought, this is what it means to have chosen well. Their son was born just after dawn with a voice like a small, indignant trumpet, and a fuzz of dark hair, and eyes that in the first days were the unfocused dark blue of all newborns, but that opened, in the weeks that followed, into a warm amber that was unmistakably his father's. They named him Thomas Henry Watkins, Thomas for the boy who had helped her run her store all these years, and Henry for her father. Thomas Bright was so moved by the honor of the first name that he could barely speak for several minutes when they told him, and then he said, "I'll be the best godfather in the state of Texas," which she had no doubt was true. Henry Watkins, as the baby came to be called, Thomas Henry being too long for daily life, was an opinionated and vivid child from his first weeks, and he reminded Ella strongly of herself in the best possible way. Perry held him with the careful attention of a man who understands that the most important things require the most careful handling, and she watched him do this, and felt the full deep current of her love for him run clear and certain as the creek on their 40 acres. The store continued. She went back to work 6 weeks after Henry was born with Mrs. Avery watching the baby in the mornings, and the life arranged itself around the new center without any loss of the old structure. The accounts, the ordering, the customers, the rhythms of the trade. Thomas managed with increasing independence, and she had begun to think about whether he might, in a few years, want to become a full partner. In the spring of 1885, when Henry was 6 months old and had recently discovered the remarkable power of his own voice, Ella found herself standing at the window of the store on a Tuesday afternoon, wiping down the glass with a damp cloth, watching the dusty Main Street the way she always had. The light was golden in the way of late afternoons in spring, and she could see Perry at the end of the street talking to James Caldwell, both of them with their hats off in the easy way of men who trust each other. He was gesturing at something on the horizon, making some point about the ranch, and she could see from the angle of his body and the particular tilt of his head that he was pleased about something. She watched him and she thought about all of it, the day he had ridden in on his dark bay horse with the white stripe, the provisions he had asked for in a quiet voice, the candle in the window, the sheriff's warning, her own steady conviction, the hours on the porch under the stars. The ring placed on the table with an honesty she still found beautiful when she thought about it, the vows they had written themselves, the house with the west-facing window, the small boy sleeping in the back room under Mrs. Avery's watchful care. She thought about the distance between warning and truth, the gap between what people feared about others and what those others actually were, and she thought about what it cost and what it was worth to trust your own reading of a person when the community around you had settled into a different story about them. She thought about the particular quality of Perry Watkins that she had seen from the beginning and that the months had only confirmed and deepened, the steadiness, the honesty, the capacity for care and for quiet, the Dickens novel on the park bench in the fading light. She was still holding the cloth. She had stopped wiping the window. Perry looked up from his conversation with Caldwell across the length of the street and saw her in the window. He raised his hand in that easy, specific way he had, and she raised hers back, and then he smiled full and warm, the smile she had first seen in her store months ago that had changed everything about his face, and she felt it the same way she had felt it the first time, which was as a kind of light moving through her. She went back to work. In the summer of 1885, Perry filed a formal claim on the 40 acres, and a portion of the adjacent land that Caldwell was willing to let go, which brought the Watkins property to just over 90 acres, enough for a proper small ranching operation independent of Caldwell's, though they maintained their partnership. He started with a small herd of 20 cattle and 5 horses, and the work was hard in the way that good work is, demanding and satisfying in equal proportion. He had a way with the horses especially that James Caldwell called the best he had seen outside of the Apache horsemen in New Mexico, and Perry received this compliment with the embarrassment of a man who is not used to praise. Ella watched him build this operation the way she had watched him build the house, with a particular focused patience, each thing done properly before the next was started. She recognized it as the same quality she had always applied to the store, and she thought that they were alike in this more than they were different in most things, and that this was good and also occasionally maddening, because two people who are both careful and determined and sure of their own judgment will sometimes be sure of it in opposite directions. They had their disagreements, real ones, not just the book-stacking variety. They disagreed about money. She was conservative, and he was willing to invest in risk she found uncomfortable. And they worked this out slowly over several discussions that were more argument than conversation. They disagreed once, seriously and painfully, about a decision he made regarding a fence line that affected access to a portion of her land from the store road. And it took them 3 days and 2 very honest conversations to resolve it. And at the end of it, they both said things they needed to say and heard things they needed to hear, and came through the other side with something between them that was stronger for having been tested. This was what she had known from the beginning, she thought, not that loving Perry Watkins would be easy, because nothing worth having was ever simply easy, but that it would be real. And real was what she had always wanted. In the autumn of 1886, Henry had begun to walk, and then to run, and then to conduct himself at maximum velocity in all directions, which was how Ella had apparently been as a toddler, according to Mrs. Avery, who claimed to remember it clearly. He was bright and curious and opinionated and prone to asking why about everything, and Perry answered every why with the same patient attention he brought to everything. And this was one of the countless things that accumulated in her heart over the years like a treasury. She was expecting again by Christmas of 1886. This pregnancy felt different from the first. She was more settled in herself, less frightened of the unknown, and the summer was cooler than the last, which helped. Their daughter was born in August of 1887, 3 years almost to the month from the day Perry Watkins had ridden into Sagebrush Creek on his dark bay horse. They named her Clara June Watkins. She was born with her mother's coloring, Ella's dark hair, and the particular gray-green eyes that had been her father's. And she was, from her first week, a child of enormous personality and relatively few doubts. When Ella held Clara in the lamplight of their bedroom on the first night, Henry asleep in the next room, Perry beside her with his arm around her shoulders, and the summer darkness outside the west window with the candle burning in it. She always kept a candle in the west window, had never stopped. It had become simply the thing they did, the light in the window, she thought. This is the story I chose. This exact story. When the sheriff warned me and I put the candle in the window anyway. The store grew. Thomas Bright became a full partner in 1888, which was the right decision for every reason, and which Ella recognized as one of the best she had made in a life of generally good decisions. He was 24 by then, and steady as a rock and better at managing people than she was in the specific way of someone who had no irritation for foolishness, whereas she had a small but non-zero amount. The Collins and Bright General Store was what the sign said over the door, and she felt a satisfaction about the name on the sign that she thought her father would have shared. Perry's small ranch began to generate a consistent living by 1889. The cattle operation was modest but solid, and the horsework was becoming its own enterprise. He had a reputation along a 3-county area for the quality of his horses and the honesty of his prices, and men came from Laredo and beyond to deal with him. He had gone from a man who owned nothing to a man who had built something, and he had built it in the direct and incremental way she had always trusted, without shortcuts or schemes, just work and time and good judgment. Henry started school in 1889, and was immediately the student most likely to ask the teacher questions she had not prepared for, which Ella received with amusement, and Perry received with the particular pride of a father whose child is exactly who they hoped they would be. Clara, 2 years behind him, would follow in 1891, and would immediately become the student most likely to have organized 3 other students into a project before the teacher arrived, which was perhaps not surprising. Sheriff Dolan retired in 1890, the November when Ella was 30 years old. The town gave him a dinner and a good speech and a silver pocket watch, and when he shook Perry's hand at the end of the evening, he held it a little longer than a handshake requires, and said something in a low voice that Ella did not hear. Perry nodded. Later, in their wagon driving home under the vast November stars, she asked him what Dolan had said. Perry was quiet for a moment, handling the reins easily in the way she still found pleasant to watch. He said he was wrong about me from the beginning and he was sorry it took him so long to say it clearly. She rested her head against his shoulder. That's a good man saying that. It is, he agreed. I always thought he was, essentially. Just stubborn. You always think the most generous, accurate thing about people, he said. It's one of the things I love best about you. She considered this. It's a practical choice more than a generous one. Most people are mostly decent if you give them room to be. I know. He put one arm around her as they rode, the horse moving steadily through the dark road home. You gave me room. You deserved it. I wasn't sure I did then. I know, she said. I was sure for both of us. The stars were very bright above the flat Texas plain. She could see the ones her father had taught her, and some that Perry had added to her knowledge, learned during his years under open skies. She could see their property coming up on the right, the dark bulk of the house and the small, warm square of the candle in the west window where Mrs. Avery had been sitting with the children and had, as always, lit the candle when the dark came. The light in the window, the same as it had always been, a warmth in the dark that meant, here, come here, you are not warned away, you are welcomed. She thought of the night she had first lit it, 3 weeks after Perry Watkins had ridden into town, and one day after Hank Dolan had stood at her counter and told her to keep her doors locked against him. She had stood in the quiet store with the lamp in her hand, and she had thought, the sheriff's warnings are his best guess and my experience is my own, and they are not the same thing. She had put the candle in the window with the specific intention of a woman who knows her own mind, and her own mind had been right. Perry stopped the wagon beside the house and helped her down, and they went inside to where Mrs. Avery had the children tucked in and supper keeping warm on the stove, and they ate together at the kitchen table while Mrs. Avery told them about Henry's question that afternoon. Why do candles need to burn down? Why can they not just stay at the same size? And Clara's response, which had been to suggest that everything in the world was trying to become something else, and candles were just more obvious about it. And Mrs. Avery had looked at the 4-year-old with an expression that suggested she was not entirely certain what to do with this information. Perry laughed at this so fully that the lamp flickered. Ella watched him laugh and thought the same thing she had thought the first time she saw his full smile, that it changed everything about his face, that she would never stop being glad she knew it. The years continued. Ella and Perry Watkins built their life on the flat Texas land with the wide sky and the creek on the east side of the property, and the stars that came out every clear night over the horizon that her west-facing window looked out on. The store prospered. The ranch grew, steady and honest. Thomas Bright proved himself one of the finest business partners a person could have. Henry grew into a tall, quiet boy with his father's amber eyes and his mother's habit of reading everything. And Clara grew into a quick and vivid girl who had both their stubbornness, and it turned out, a remarkable talent for mathematics that surprised everyone except her mother, who had always suspected it. Sagebrush Creek itself changed over the years: a second church, a proper school building, a new hotel, the telegraph wire extended west, and the world changed too, the open range gradually giving way to fenced land, the cattle drives shortening, the railroad pushing west and changing what commerce meant. But some things held constant. The store on Main Street with its clean windows. The Watkins Ranch on the 40 acres east of town with its creek and its west-facing porch. The candle in the window at dark. The way Perry Watkins looked at his wife across a room or a table or a wagon seat, which was the way a man looks at the person who gave him room to become what he could be. The way Ella Collins, Ella Watkins now, and Ella Collins Watkins on official documents because she had not been willing to give up either name, which had been nobody's business but hers and Perry's. And Perry had said it seemed entirely right, looked at him back. which was the look of a woman who knows exactly what she saw and what she chose, and has never for one day regretted either. Henry Watkins was 12 years old when he asked his mother one evening while helping to close the store where the story of his parents had begun. She was counting the till and she did not stop counting, but she smiled. "A drifter rode into town on a Tuesday in May," she said, "and the sheriff warned me he was dangerous." Henry considered this. "Was he?" "Not to me," she said. "What did you do?" She finished counting the till and closed the ledger and looked at her son, who had his father's eyes and her father's name and the careful, attentive quality of someone who was always really listening. "I left a candle in the window for him," she said, "and he came home." Henry was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is that why we always keep the candle in the west window?" "That's why," she said. He thought about this with the serious thoroughness of a 12-year-old who finds meaning important. "That's a good story," he said finally. "It's the best one I know," Ella said, "because it's true." She locked the store and they walked home together down the evening street, and the stars were coming out above the flat Texas horizon, and in the west window of the house on the 40 acres, the candle was already burning. Perry, she knew without needing to see it, always lit it when he came in from the day's work, before supper, before anything else. The candle first. The light in the window. The thing they had built their whole life on the edge of. She walked toward it as she always did, as she would always do, through the warm Texas dark with the crickets loud in the grass and the sky full of stars above the wide, flat, beautiful, difficult, tremendous land she had never needed to leave because everything she had ever needed had, in the end, found its way to her. The light was on. She was going home.